Aayush, what are we looking at?
We're looking at exactly where we are right now. I couldn't take you outdoors for this one, so I thought, why not recreate it in our very studio?
So this is essentially Lower Parel, but what are the various red dots that you see there?
The red dots that you see, what if I told you that these are all, well, they were all originally mill lands, and a lot of them now have become malls.
Yeah, okay, clearly. I think I can probably spot Phoenix there.
You can spot Kamla as well, right? And it's starting obviously from Mahalakshmi Racecourse all the way into the region. It stretches up to Elphinstone Road. But Alex, I've been born and raised here, and I've seen this change over the last 3 decades. We never had shopping complexes. We had small markets, and now you have these malls, but you never realized that all of this development was perhaps, well, there was an ugly side to it as well.
Yes, and that actually showed just last week, in fact, and several times over the course of
several instances, right? In fact, if I can actually take you through all the instances all over in Mumbai over the last 6 months, right? It starts off on July 25th, 2017, a building collapse in Ghatkopar, 17 dead, 11 injured. A lot of questions were asked, a lot of them, absolutely. Yes. We move on, and you think you've barely recovered from this. August 29th. Yeah. You remember that day?
Of course. I took about 3 hours to get home.
I was stranded in office.
And I live in Mahim, which is...
I was stranded in office. One of, the worst monsoon deluges we've actually come across for the last decade at least.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? City brought to a grinding halt. You recover from, well, the weather gods not really working.
And then you had the building collapse in Bhindi Bazaar.
Which was, again,
just a few
tragedy. A tragedy for a number of reasons. Again, a very crowded, cluttered place. And that's not all. August 31st was not the end of it. You move on. And September 29th, just a month later...
Aayush, this happened just behind this building, right here. And we're pointing that way.
Yeah.
It happened right here. So if you probably look outside, you'll probably see the station from here.
This is, well, a shocking instance of perhaps bad planning and, well, calls for a bridge being made that were never answered. And
a lot of
chaos.
measures that were perhaps not the most efficient measures that were taken after that.
Not just that. You just go on into December and you think the year's, well, actually drawing to a close.
The first fire in December that was talked about, Sakinaka.
Talked about. There are fires every day, Alex.
Yeah.
But then all of us really woke up and was shocked and appalled and aghast
at the end of the year.
At what happened.
At the end of the year, which is the Kamla Mills fire, which was a really unfortunate incident at the end of the year. And a lot of questions were asked at several points. I believe there was also a lot of talk at the time that the Elphinstone incident took place of poor planning, poor infrastructure. But really, I've been wondering, is this something that can be fixed?
Yeah.
What is the genesis of the problem that is?
Absolutely. And Alex, doesn't it bother you that we only wake up after these tragedies and disasters? Maybe there's a bigger problem. Maybe, well, we need to get solutions to
Well, it's a new year.
problem.
Perhaps we need to stop, pause, and see what we can do from this stage on.
Absolutely.
We're not the people who can talk about what we can possibly do.
Yeah.
We're not experts. We have experts with us.
Yeah.
And they're sitting right here. We're walking towards them right now. We have with us Mr. Chandrasekhar Prabhu, who is an urban planning expert, very well known in the sector. And we also have Mrs. Amita Bhede, who is the Dean at the School of Habitat Studies at TIS. Thank you so much for speaking to us here at Bloomberg Quint.
Let's have a seat now. Yeah. But I must, well, inform our viewers that we'll keep getting up whenever we get these lovely, maps popping up and structures popping up. And we want to explain, ma'am, sir, what really went wrong. That's what Alex and my conversation was at the start, saying we only wake up when these tragedies or unfortunate incidents actually occur. Is what really went wrong? If you could take us through the genesis of this problem, saying, is it from the 90s when we moved from these mills to malls, or is there, well, a much bigger problem?
I would see this really as a failure of planning on 2 big counts. Right from the time when we have the Maharashtra Town Planning Act in 1966, that has really, at one level, the failure has been in terms of the failure of the plan to talk about the poor and the marginalized sections, which means that we have almost created like a dual city, right? So there is a city which is planned, and that planned city is increasingly then overwhelmed by a city which is highly informal and built up from the ground, and we have no templates of how this growth actually takes place. So this is the first count of failure. I think post 1990s, the city tried to get out of this stranglehold that it felt, both from the informal planning point of view as well as the spatial stranglehold that it was facing. No office space, no space for further expansion for the realty sector, etc. And it has tried to do that by getting into another mode, and which is of flexibilizing all the rules which govern the built environment and the construction of that built environment. I think temporarily there were solutions which were seen as win-win solutions. Okay? For each of our problems that we faced linked to housing or the built environment. So if there is like a parking problem, we have a solution in the form of FSI. If we have a slum problem, we have a solution in the form of FSI. You have dilapidated buildings, you have a solution in the form of FSI. But in doing that, I think what we have created is an even bigger monster. And that bigger monster is that of the second count of failure of planning, and which is basically that now we have refused to plan at all.
If we're talking about the Lower Parel area per se,
let me give you a slightly different perspective. The perspective is such that you do a policy and work exactly against it. In the 70s, it was decided that the city is growing in a linear fashion. If you take a compass and put southern Mumbai as one part and draw a circle, the segment in which the city grows is just 10 degrees out of 360 degrees. All over the world, where cities grow in 360 degrees. Mumbai is perhaps the only city which grows only in that segment
because
of the geographical limitation. So this was a growth which we planners call a linear growth. Instead of growing linear, it was decided that you grow lateral. Now what is lateral? Beyond the Thane Creek was the entire place which is now called Navi Mumbai. So you grow there and create links. So the growth of a city, the natural growth which was happening towards either Ahmedabad or Nasik on one side, was planned to be growing there. Now what would be the essential ingredients? Number one, no more commercialization of South Mumbai.
Yes.
Number two, shifting of all major commercial establishment from South Mumbai to the hinterland. What do you do in implementation? What you do is you take exactly what can the most opposite be. The most opposite is, this is a triangle with Daisar on one side, Mulund on the other, and South Mumbai on the other. What is the exact opposite you can
get
do?
People to come to South
you reclaim 180 hectares in Nariman Point
and Cuff Parade
and Cuff Parade and build commercial structures. Nariman was a person who fought against the British because the British wanted to reclaim 2 acres of land. So he was the then Congress president, Mahatma Gandhi's aide, who said, I will sit on a hunger strike and not permit even 1 inch of reclamation. And funnily enough, the largest scam in the form of reclamation going against the policy was finally named after Nariman. Poor person must be turning in his grave. Fortunately, the Supreme Court had to turn down reclamation. It's not the wisdom of either the planners or the politicians which saved the day then. It was the Supreme Court which said, you can't do this. This is your policy, you're working against it. Either you say that's not your policy or you, so diametrically opposite. So then they said, okay, revision of policy. So now what is the revision of policy? We recognize that the city needs to be decongested. So everyone is coming from northern part of Mumbai into southern part in the morning. And the railways are bursting in its seams with 65 accidents per day, resulting in almost 10 deaths every day. That's what the statistics was then, and it's not very different today. So what do? You create a situation wherein a commercial district comes halfway down. So those living in southern part of Mumbai will use it in the non-traffic period to go to north, because the trains were otherwise going empty. They were bringing in people, dumping them here and going empty in the morning, and the same in the evening. So what was the policy? Very sound policy, that have commercial districts in different parts, but that presumed that South Mumbai will be kept out of the commercial district. So BKC became a possible commercial. No, not Lower Parel. That's what I'm trying to say. The island city of Mumbai, which means up to Mahim on one side and Sion on the other, to be kept free of any commercial. There was a ban on commercialization of the island city.
So if I may ask...
And that policy assumed BKC to be commercial, assumed Bhandup to be commercial, assumed Oshiwara to be commercial. So there were more commercial places, so those living in suburbs don't have to come to the island city. They can work there. And those in island city will go against the tide and use the railways which go empty. Made good sense. Now, good policy. Now, what can happen? Exactly the opposite. That ban on commercialization in island city, bang, bring in 900 acres of commercial in the form of mill. So every policy which people who think about the city bring, and then in its wisdom government accepts and agrees on and does exactly the opposite. That's what has been happening.
Obviously, you've explained this entire overarching theme of a contradiction of policy, but then if we're talking about Lower Parel per se, that's another example of a complete contradiction of policy. You had the mill land that was initially intended for commercial purposes. When the mill owners said this is unviable.
No, it wasn't. It was never meant for commercial purposes. That's the thing.
Okay.
Mill lands belonged to private individuals 150 years ago. The then British government acquired it from the private individuals. There have been case studies wherein the then owners went to the court saying that our rights are being taken away by the British. The courts held that these places will provide employment. The city will grow around these places. The port will grow around these places, and it is for public good, because at least 250,000 people will get jobs.
Yes.
And that is why these were not commercial. They were industrial.
So what went wrong there?
No, they were industrial areas. Each of the industrial area, every mill had a water body in there. Every mill had a minimum of 5,000 trees, which they retained as it is when the lands came. And around those trees and around the green environment came the mills.
Right.
So you had the oxygen coming out, you had the water there, everything was there. Over a period of years, when the Chinese started making artificial cloth, so for the natural textile made out of cotton,
It became unviable.
It became a bit unviable. It could have been made viable had it been modernized.
Yes.
But the money from the mill was drawn and siphoned off, never used back in the mills. So all the profits from the mills were treated as ill-gotten wealth and taken away.
Yes.
Not just out of the mills, but also out of the country in
Right.
many cases.
Right.
And the mills were deliberately starved and strangulated. The only word, the word that describes the whole mill area is a process of strangulation.
If we're talking about the issue of the mill land and the use of the mill land and the initial plan, from my understanding, of taking 1/3 of the land that was supposed to be sold at that point, allowed by the Maharashtra government, 1/3 of that was supposed to be used for urban housing, 1/3 of that was supposed to be used for civic amenities, and 1/3 could be retained by the mill owners. But that was turned on its head in 2001.
No,
No,
again,
correctly.
that's sorry. Go ahead.
No, so this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 plan was also something which was agreed upon as a negotiation. Because the first claim, I think, which was made
Yes.
by Charles Correa and an alternate plan which was proposed was, how do we give back all of this land to the public purpose itself? Right? And here, this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you have to understand, is itself a different kind of a negotiation.
So we'll continue that conversation, but Ayush, you've
sir,
got
I
another
was-
map for us.
No, I'm saying, even considering the first map, we couldn't pull it out in exact detail. And whilst, sir was mentioning some of those interesting things about the history of this mill land, look at what it's become right now, right? And if we were actually whilst he was actually explaining it, I found it fascinating. There's nearly, 20 of those red dots?
18.
And nearly 18 of them, and we've not even covered, ma'am, we've not covered what's on the other side. Bombay Dyeing, Shakti Mill, this is only Lower Parel, Elphinstone Road.
Do you know that what constitutes part of the mill lands today was the headquarters of British India?
Absolutely.
And the governor lived here in Parel. There was no governor house in Malabar Hills.
So, that points to a bigger problem. If all of this was, over the years modernized, it wasn't envisioned hundreds of years ago to be, malls and complexes or shopping areas or commercial places.
Obviously,
That's
not-
where the
not
planning
just
went
that,
wrong.
but
On
it
the
is-
contrary, the land, when it was taken, there were undertakings given to the court then saying that if for any reason
Yeah.
the mill owners don't want to use it for the purpose, they shall hand it over back to the government. Industrial land you are given for mills, your lease says you shall use this for mill and mill alone, and mill is for industrial purpose, not for commercial purpose. There is a vast difference between using it for industrial purpose and for commercial purpose, because the infrastructure usage differs hell of a lot. Then the government should have said, okay, this is the lease terms, you're not following the lease terms, thank you very much. We get the money
Reclaim the
back.
land.
And if necessary, government could have put it to alternate use and paid them some compensation, if at all compensation had to be given. But instead, what was done, that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which appears to be very saintly today, in itself was also a scam.
Which is what we want to speak about, Ayush, is that, okay, all that's happened has happened over the course of nearly 2.5, 3 decades. But where we stand right now is the most important part. Can we do something from this?
And before we get to that, just since we started off, and let's be honest, we've all woken up after what happened at Kamla Mills, and that's a case in point. If we actually could pull up, what Kamla Mills looks like, it's exactly this. If you look at Kamla Mills in this particular map, this is, of course, a real life terrain map of Kamla Mills. All those red dots, Alex, are restaurants, eateries and pubs that we could actually trace, which are still open. Some of them were shut down.
35 of them.
Nearly 37 of them. I'm saying, in that land that Sir and Ma'am were actually talking about, you have so much happening in the day because it's a commercial hub as well. You have a lot of media houses and a lot of offices there. And post sunset, it becomes the nightlife district of the city. So coming to your question, were we woefully underprepared for something like that? And it's not just that. There's a Todi Mills, there's a Raghuvanshi Mills, Phoenix Mills, and other places in the suburbs as well, western suburbs.
Yeah, but you just mentioned the word underprepared. underprepared is something when you know what you're doing. Here, you didn't know. You just had a knee-jerk reaction and you sold the city to the greed of the developers. You just sold the city to the greed of the developer, and everyone wanted his slice of the cake. So the media got their slice of cake, everybody got their slice of cake, and no one wanted to admit, but everyone wanted space, and this was the space that was available. Getting space in BKC would have been difficult because that was owned by the government. Here you could pay in cash, a lot of black money could change hand, you could do what you want, and it was the biggest scam of the century.
So we're talking about 2018, where we stand today.
Yep.
You know, is this all water under the bridge, or rather the baby thrown away with the bath water, or is there something that can really be done?
Is there perhaps a modern day solution which we can come up with, saying, okay, this is the problem, it's culminated over years, it's exacerbated with what's happened over the last few years with urbanization and industrialization, but is there a solution now using perhaps some modern means?
The question is, for the solution, you need to first finalize the approach.
Right.
Every solution comes out of how you approach the problem. Right. Now, what is going to be your approach? What is going to be your approach of the title? The land is owned by someone, leased out by government. The leases have been terminated. Some of them don't have lease. Is the government going to continue with the lease, or what they are going to do? One is the issue of title.
Right.
Second is the issue of user. Industrial user requires X amount of infrastructure. Commercial user requires 10x or whatever.
Right.
So whether you're going to allocate user discriminately or just permit anything to come. That's the second. Third is, you really have to take a decision with regard to what is going to happen to this area, to those who are not connected with mills at all. Right. There are residents. This area is occupied by 580,000 people who have nothing to do with the mill land. Now, have you ever even considered that they exist? You have not. That's the third approach. The fourth is, for any planning solution, you need to assess the carrying capacity. It's a science. It's not something which I would make different and she would make different. For any area which comes up for development, you work out, this is the area, this is the infrastructure, work the numbers, what is the carrying capacity? We have been trained to work out carrying capacities of various areas. So you have to work out a carrying capacity. Your infrastructure in these is lower. The carrying capacity infrastructure is not. So then you augment the infrastructure, bring it at least at par, and then go further and create additional infrastructure, making people's life easier.
I wanted to add a couple of points to what he said, because these are very critical points. Right. And I think one of the things is that definitely there has to be a review of all the upcoming projects, okay, which are coming, and there are huge ones. There are cluster redevelopment projects, there are huge, the BDD Chawl projects is right in the vicinity, and where again the density that is expected to rise is like 4 times the entire current density, right? You also have huge slum redevelopment projects again coming up in the vicinity. I was just reviewing also the disaster management plan of this entire area, and I find that, for example, fires, the extreme narrowness of roads in relation to the kind of uses which are coming up don't even figure as possible problems in the disaster management plan. Okay, what the problems which figure in are basically waterlogging, then there are some temporary shelters.
And buying of equipment. Everyone wants buying of equipment because you get a kickback in that.
Okay.
So where do we figure in and even prepare for those disasters, right?
Yeah. So very clearly there is a requirement to create a master plan.
So first you decide on approach. Once you take decisions on your approach,
I really found your fourth one very interesting because you said augment that infrastructure, which was one of my older questions. How do you actually augment?
Of course you can augment
existing infrastructure in Mumbai.
For instance, a mill,
Yeah.
which is 600 acres of mill, had its own water. It didn't require the city to provide it its water.
Right.
Its water was in the holding ponds. Now, without taking, they could still have kept those holding ponds and trees and yet had these monstrous buildings
Yes.
come up there. But you deliberately permitted them to destroy those natural springs. Koinur Mill had 37 natural springs which gave pure water. Now you destroyed all that. So what happens? Are you going to revive them? It all depends on how you are going to approach and to what extent you are willing to go, and then once your approach is clear, from that emerges the solutions. And when the solution comes, then what Ms. Bide said is relevant, because what happens to future development?
We have several issues in this area.
Correct.
Are there any things that we can do over the course of the next 1 year, 1.5 years?
We can definitely do, but what I think Mr. Prabhu is also trying to suggest, and I would assert that, perhaps also reiterate that there cannot be shortcuts to this kind of issue.
Right.
So the augmentation of infrastructure cannot happen by saying, let's have one flyover and then a flyover over a flyover, because that's not going to resolve the issues, right? What we require is basically, in terms of looking at all the redevelopment projects which are coming up, how can we appropriate public land or land for public purpose from those redevelopments?
No, that's
and
very-
for
and that's
this,
very key.
one will need to curb and think about or have a rethink about
Absolutely,
redevelopment.
ma'am. And there are issues in metro cities. There is one city that got it right. In India, in terms of, and I'm not saying this as a one-size-fits-all solution, being Chandigarh. It's a urban planning a model that's touted all over the world as a very successful one, being India's perhaps best planned city. The new ones coming up, be it Naya Raipur being an example, or Amravati near Vijayawada, Andhra Pradesh. When these cities are coming up, is that perhaps a better model? Because you're starting from scratch. You're pooling land, perhaps you're not acquiring, which was an original plan in Kamla Mills as well. Is that the way forward for even satellite towns or newer cities coming up in the country?
In fact, what I would say, all these examples that you've quoted are perhaps very bad examples.
Okay.
Bad examples because all of these cities actually fail for the first count of planning failure that I talked about, which is that you need to recognize that India is a country which is a developing country.
Right.
Okay? And therefore, we need to use land with that optimum of utilization, keep it within the public realm, use it maximally possible, because Chandigarh model, you are saying, has been celebrated all over the world. I would say it has been critiqued all over the world, because in creating one Chandigarh, it has created several peripheral settlements all around Chandigarh. If you look at the state of what is happening in Panchkula, it's a mess, right? So if to create one planned city, one is going to create 5 messes, or if to create one Navi Mumbai, you have the Ulhasnagar and Kalyan Dombivli and Virar and all of these are the costs for that.
But is there any way to get it right?
Yes,
the
there is.
conventional,
What is the
And that is, I think, that we need to first create a strong public realm. We have to be clear that the objective of planning is to not create an elite city, but it has to be a city which gives preference to a public purpose per se.
There is a very common saying amongst architects and planners that it takes 25 Panchkulas having disastrous consequences to keep one Chandigarh a planned city. So it takes Vasai Virar and Thane and all that in disastrous condition to keep Mumbai into a semi-planned city.
But you know, what I take away from this conversation, Ayush, is the fact that there needs to be very clearly better planning with a purpose. That is not the purpose that is followed today, Ayush.
And ma'am's point, fairly taken. Public purpose is what matters, right? There has to be some sort of purpose. I take that point. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us, ma'am, sir. That's about all the time we have on this show. And thanks so much for tuning in to Bloomberg Quint.
We are here with Raghuram Rajan, and he is, of course, the former central banker of India, now back at the University of Chicago Booth School, and he joins us now. Thanks for being with us. You were famous for, in 2005, warning that policymakers weren't seeing the dangers of rising asset prices. I'll do the market check for everybody today. Dow is over 21,100. So are you concerned again now about asset price inflation?
Well, whenever there's asset price inflation, you have to ask why it is that.